Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I'm here with CEO and founder Arun Bahl of Aloe. Arun, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure, Eric.
Today's topic for today's podcast is about AI, and I think you're uniquely qualified to talk about the space since your startup is in the AI space. Do you want to kind of give the audience an overview of what Aloe is and some of the AI components that you're building right now?
Yeah, sure, totally. I'm the founder and CEO of Aloe. I am a serial technical founder. My background is in AI. And Aloe is an AI powered dashboard for whatever you're working on. It's targeting specifically knowledge workers, and it brings the right information into focus for you. It helps you to eliminate distractions, and it even handles tasks on your behalf. So once we figure out what it is that you're working on, we can help you to ensure that you have the resources that you need to do it. And if we see a step that we could potentially automate for you, we offer to take it off of your plate entirely so that you can keep your eyes on the big picture.
Cool. I know you, because of that great intro of your startup, is a great intro into what we want to talk about, which is like all these changes and innovations in the AI space.
Sure.
I mean, everyone's been talking about Chat GPT lately,
Yep.
but I know there's so much else going on. So I mean, through your startup, through your participation in Berkeley SkyDeck and just general participation in the ecosystem, let's put Chat GPT aside for a moment. What are some of the other big changes that you've noticed in the AI space that our viewers and listeners should be aware of?
Should be aware of. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are two really big changes that have sort of been seismic in the last few years in AI, and they are related to each other. The first is the way that we handle semantic understanding in AI. And this is things like word embeddings. It's about being able to look at the context of a word or even a subword and understand a deeper sense of meaning than you would have in just doing sort of a lookup of that word. And then the other is what's happening in generative AI, of which ChatGPT is one example, but not the only one. And that has certainly been huge. I mean, it's huge in a number of ways, right? It's rare for the most recent interesting AI paper to be featured on Trevor Noah's show, right? So there's definitely something that's like tapped into the cultural zeitgeist. But beyond that, there are a couple of really interesting attributes of the kinds of models that we're seeing, like ChatGPT, and one of them is the stability of these models. And this is true for things like Stable Diffusion. They're doing all these crazy image avatar things too. It used to be that there was a whole lot of retraining for specific applications that needed to happen,
Hmm.
and a lot of brittleness for a system that was then exposed to data that was different, or an environment that was different from its training data. And what we're seeing is that these models they're pretty stable, and rather than having to do a lot of retraining and fine tuning, you still can, and for many applications that's important. You actually get pretty far by what prompt you give the system in itself. And so prompt engineering, right, can actually, for a system like ChatGPT, can get you some really interesting output. And so that's been pretty cool. It's there's some massive downsides. They don't always get attention, depending on what circle you're traveling in. One of the obvious ones is that the with ChatGPT in particular, uh, it creates prose and sometimes code and sometimes poetry, right? But it creates language with a tone of confidence that is completely orthogonal to whether what it's saying is true or not. And
Hmm.
so there is a potential there for it to be misleading, because it is, we I think we do ourselves a service when we recognize that these are language models. They are not knowledge models. There's a difference, right? And certainly a system like this needs a whole lot of knowledge to be able to understand and contextualize human language. We speak in metaphor so much of the time; it's impossible to parse an English sentence without knowing something about the way the world works, right? So but it was trained to be languagey, right? In a way that's not exactly the same as being like a font of knowledge. And so we have to make sure that we don't use it in that way.
Well, that's really interesting what you mentioned about the technical innovations going on, and especially the social ones, and the implications. I want to focus a bit more. I think the big thing overarching, and it kind of includes Chat GPT, is the contextual. Like, can you dive a bit further and like what has gone on to make AI a bit more understanding of like its context?
It's a really good question. It doesn't always understand this context,
Mm.
but one of the interesting things that that happened some years ago that sort of powered a lot of this is that we have better ways to take input data and imagine storing information in space, right? Like points in space somehow, right? Where the distance between 2 points is a function of how related they are to each other. That's basically how it works. And if you can do that, and if you can do that well, right? And it may not be 3-dimensional space. It could be 700-dimensional space, right? But the same rules apply, however many axes you might have, right? That was a really interesting breakthrough. And it started with one of the earliest examples. It was not the first, but Meta had an engine called Word2Vec that has some really interesting examples in it, right? So like they had nodes that represented words, let's say, right? And they were positioned in this imaginary space, right? But they found that there were some interesting properties of the way that the system learned to position those things, right? There was an example where it was, I might get the details a little bit wrong, but it was effectively something like if you took the word king and you removed because they're all coordinates, they're all numbers, right? If you subtracted the coordinates for the word male and then added the coordinates for the word female, you got to the same position as queen, right? So like that suggests that there was on some level, right? And I believe that was a 300-dimensional model. On some level, there was the machine was beginning to like position things based on some core concept, right? And so that if you can do that well, and like there are trade-offs there, right? Like you might be able to get further with a model with a whole lot more dimensions, right? Twice, 3 times, 8 times as many. That becomes a problem for what we can handle computationally, right? And so therefore things like cost and memory and those kinds of things. But that core, like having that spatial representation, lets us do some really cool things. And if we can know that those concepts are positioned well in space, we can that gets us pretty far. The problem is, of course, that these AI models are trained on data from a world that isn't fair. And so there are biases that show up. I think, especially coming from, as a kid watching sci-fi, we sort of think of AI as being something that is prescriptive. We think of data on Star Trek and, wouldn't it be wonderful, right? But really, AI, the way we handle deep learning today anyway, is it's not prescriptive in any real way. It's descriptive. It's us holding up a mirror to society, right? Because all the data that's used to train these systems is data that's come out of our world. And specifically in this case, it's the internet. So it's a predominantly English language world, and it's a certain socioeconomic bracket and all those things. And so all the biases that we see that are sort of the products of our society are represented in that data and could be present in how those models are trained. And so therefore, where a language system would choose to position those concepts in space. So that's definitely a thing that we have to be watching out for actively.
It's interesting, and that was one of the other points that you had brought up, is kind of like the societal implications or cultural. I want to touch on something before we kind of go down that route in terms of what you said, which is, especially with Chat GPT as an example, it's very, didn't use necessarily the word authoritative, right? But it gives off the impression that it is a knowledge base, right? It might be, it's you're the neuroscientist, right, by training, so it's the authoritative like tone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
I think what it boils down to is, as an AI startup founder and as someone who cares about society, do you think that AI founders themselves, they acknowledge some of these issues, at least some of them do. But do you think it is their responsibility, or is it societal responsibility? And what I mean by that is it something that we have to train people on? So I'll give you an example. I think the New York Times covered in an article a year or two ago concerning how they're integrating misinformation education. And what I mean by that is they're not educating misinformation, but they're educating students on how to read for or look for misinformation.
Sure.
Do you think
Yeah.
that's something that we also need to think about with AI?
Yes, absolutely. I think that we do. I think that it's humans have always struggled with judicious use, right? Like
Mhm.
the breakthroughs are great. I don't think anybody would argue that we should not split the atom, but there are only certain applications of that that are morally tenable. And the same is true for AI, right? And so if we're, yeah, if we're currently at a place in the technology, and you know, we might be able to get around that eventually, right? But if we're currently at a place where that tone of authoritativeness or confidence has nothing to do with whether there's accuracy involved, then we have to ensure that we are making it clear to users that there are real limitations, and there are, you know, AI, I think, is at most half of the battle here, right? There's, like you're saying, there's education. There's a user experience issue here, right? Like I'm I'm obviously deeply interested in the technology of AI, but I would say I'm even more interested in how we use it, right? Like how do we actually take this amazing technology and build applications and experiences that correspond with human values? And that's a really interesting question. And you know, people look at that from an ethics perspective. Certainly, bias is a part of that. I think there's a lot more to it. Like, what are the effects, for example, of creating and disseminating tools, right? Because as a startup CEO, like that's what you're doing. You're purveying a thing, right? That's going to get consumed, and so you know, really trying to be thoughtful about what the impact of that is going to be, I think is a big part of the role.
Well, let me ask you this, because I mean, to your point, if we were, and be interested in your opinion, if we were talking about AI 10 years ago, right, its
Yeah.
impact would probably be less than it is now, right? Because
Yeah.
maybe it was, to your point, it was part of like the sci-fi consciousness that we have AI, but
Mm,
AI
yeah.
is increasingly, I would say, maybe there's a misperception in society that it's ready for prime time when it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, when it's not, right? And do you think that as a startup founder, you kind of need to take this into account, right? And the best example from my experience would be like financial services, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We, fintech founders are like, hey, I want to, make this more efficient financial process, right? And that's from, let's say an outsider's perspective in. Then they realize once they get in, it's like, oh, I need to follow XYZ regulatory rules,
Right.
or I need to follow this legislation, etc. And then they
Right.
realize sometimes it's like the technology isn't in search of a solution. The technology needs to conform to the existing framework, right? You can't like break out of it. But I guess what I want to ask you is, as an AI founder, do you think you have a not just a moral responsibility, but even as you're building your company, you have that fundamental responsibility to take into account, you know, how we promote and how we build AI. You kind of alluded to it earlier in terms
Yeah.
of some of the training of the models and some of
Yeah.
the pre-existing biases. So just kind of curious.
Yeah, totally. I think there is responsibility to do that. And I would say that I don't think that these things are not ready for prime time. I think it depends on how we position them
Mm,
and what promises we're making, like implicitly or explicitly, to users about what these things are doing, right? Like if someone believes that this is um, a window into knowledge, right? Like chatting to Chat GPT online, right? That's we've not done our job correctly because we've not communicated what this is really for, right? If, however, it's opening a portal to this weird computer imagination where things sound, super languagey again, right? But don't necessarily have a relationship um, with knowledge, citation needed, right?
mhm.
That's a different sort of experience, and it's the same underlying technology in both cases, right? But like, how are we making that available? And then on the training side, you're right. I think there's really interesting work that's been happening for a while in the academic literature and I think in industry, about thinking about what are the ways in which we can actively remove some of that bias. And some of that is, some of it it's made difficult by having models where the explainability is low, right? Like these are probabilistic things. They're statistical models at the core. And it's been hard to get a good sort of like line of sight into why a certain thing is being suggested or recommended. But there are some interesting new, there's a lot of interesting work happening in that space. And I think that helps, right? Because if at some point we can identify and say, hey, this was suggested on account of these assumptions, some of which we think are faulty or are the product of bias, then we can remove those and have the system try again.
It's interesting. I think we kind of touched on some of the ethical, some of the moral responsibility, but what about the economic ones? I was reading a headline, for instance, with Chat GPT. I guess someone had coded it to write a children's book, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of artists were justifiably or not justifiably annoyed. I mean,
Yeah.
what's your take on it?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I can share my opinion certainly.
Mm-hmm.
It is it's a crazy time for practitioners, for I mean for all of us, right? But I do think that there's a vision of AI that we hear about in the media, where like AI is here to take our jobs away, automate us out of the picture. And I I don't, of course, I don't believe in that vision. I think one of the reasons why we started Aloe is because we believe that the future of AI is to allow us to be more human, right? Like, can we delegate certain things so that we get to focus on the parts of work and productivity that are the most uh, enjoyable and meaningful to humans? And that's deep expertise in creative problem solving and relationship building and empathy, all of those sorts of things. And so I think that automation is a useful thing, again, if we apply it in the right way. Now, the writing a children's book, that's a tougher one. It's interesting to note that I think I remember the story that you're talking about. And since that company started and got the product out there, something like 3 other companies started up that did exactly the same thing. And so one of the interesting questions that this suggests, also, related economically, is that the use of some of the use we're seeing of these tools right now offers no moat. If you're a startup, there is no I think thinking really hard about what your sort of entrenched competitive advantage can be is really important. They're huge models that represent an enormous amount of money that was involved in their training. I think for GPT-3, so the predecessor to ChatGPT is built on it, and GPT-3 was the third in a series of large language models. The estimates are that it costs somewhere between $5 and $15 million to train. Wow. And I believe that's just the compute cost. That's not personnel. That's not anything else, right? The expertise required to build it. And so if these are all models that are the domain of certain powers that be that are sufficiently well funded, that does create some opportunity for extreme economic distortion if these are really powerful capabilities that are only in the hands of a few. There's a really cool project that came out of Europe, and I might get the provenance wrong, but a group called Bloom that has developed an open source version of of GPT-3, not of ChatGPT. And it's a 176 billion parameter model and can do some cool output. So I suspect we'll see more activities like that, like trying to ensure that, yes, the science needs to move ahead, and we will do better. It's better for industry to ensure that that's not just controlled by a couple sort of powers that be in AI.
I think it's interesting, and you kind of glanced over it, but in terms of the amount of compute costs, right, to just train that model. And I think people forget sometimes, right, that there is a cost, right? And it's like, oh, great, I'll just use AI to do this. Well, you have to build the model first, and that might be equivalent to many man hours of someone doing X, Y, and Z. And I think we're not at the point where, correct me if I'm wrong, that where AI is like dollars on the implementation fee, right? Training an AI model still requires time, effort, resources that could be equivalent to training one or more individuals if we're just looking at old processes.
Yes, I think that the interesting thing with something like ChatGPT is, and the question is, do you always have to train your own model? Like, is this a general purpose language model that with the right prompt is good enough for your application? That's you can still fine tune it. But there's an interesting question there too. Yeah, I mean that helps in terms of making it more accessible. But the IP and the pricing is still locked up behind one person's wall, one entity's wall, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Well, I don't know, Arun, if yeah, on this podcast, what I usually like to do is give the last word to our participants. So, being on this podcast, what would you tell people about AI, and to think about at least as they listen to this podcast and what we kind of briefly covered in terms of the changes related to AI?
Yeah, it's a great question. I I would really love people to keep in mind that these are products of the data that they were fed, and all of the same, like you were saying, like the New York Times educating people about misinformation, all of the same abilities that we've built up to sort of suss out uh, good information, true information, should still be applied here, right? We're not yet in a place where the output is being, where the guardrails are particularly robust, right? And so I think they're so much fun to use. I think there's so much potential in being able to harness these things, to combine them with things like symbolic knowledge, so that we do have like veracity of information. But we should not we should not just listen to that tone of confidence and really take into consideration what's being said. There was a great example of a someone was writing online about their child using ChatGPT to write the answer to a homework essay. I might get the details wrong. I believe it was contrasting Hobbes and Locke. It was like a political science paper. And ChatGPT put out, again, beautiful prose that sounded accurate, and it was completely wrong. Only because these are two thinkers that are frequently contrasted. They frequently appear in the same places, and ultimately these models, like the core assumption of all of this AI is that words that appear in the same place, like in the same context, must be related in some way. That's the very core of this, is that it's not that it necessarily understands meaning, it understands the meaning of a word relative to other words somehow. And there's something about that mechanism that I think if it was a little more well known, I might elucidate some of both the positives and the pitfalls of what's happening in AI.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Arun, thank you very much for participating in the podcast. I'm sure we'll definitely have more AI related podcasts in the future.
Sure. Sounds great. Thanks so much, Eric. Appreciate it.